This is Teotihuacan. You can go there. You see those little people there walking with the big pyramids? Let's say you go there. Anybody ever been to Teotihuacan? No, no takers? Me either. Should go. Look, you can be a little person walking along in see some big pyramids, climb up there. They still let you. Let's say you're there. What are you looking for? Maybe I'll put this differently. You see a big pyramid, you're walking along, and you're just a little people. Who are you looking for? What do you imagine about this city in the old days? What do you think's underneath that big pyramid? Dead people? Just little people? What do you think is there? Aren't you looking for the king? You're looking for a big king who could have commanded people to make that stuff. Somebody with more power than me who can make people labor for them, make them do things. You're looking for a king. Interestingly, if you read your text, they haven't been able to find a king in Teotihuacan. There's actually no evidence that there was a king. It seems to be that these structures were built complexly, but there was not a single ruler. Now, who knows? Maybe we'll find something, but you don't see anything like the lavish tombs that we're come to expect in other societies. This brings us to something that I want to call the deep assumptions that we have about life in the old, very old days, the origins of civilization, and all these things. These assumptions, you may not realize that you have them, but they're in so many different parts of our life. They come out in movies or what people are looking for when they go to other places or what they expect to have happen. And one of those assumptions is if you have a city, any sort of urban structures or a big monumental architecture, there must be some big man, big ruler, big king there. With Teotihuacan, they've been looking, haven't found anything that would indicate there's such a thing. Another deep assumption we talked about in the last class is that agriculture is always better than hunting and gathering. A long time ago, we used to call hunter-gatherers wild man because we thought they were just chasing after wild animals and that they were no better than the wild animals themselves. So the idea is that with agriculture, we get civilization and all the benefits that we have today. We saw in the last class, there's at least some things that might suggest that in terms of health and other measures, there's some disadvantages, at least for the early farmers. If you're not on top of the world's pyramid, you might say, if you don't get to import your agriculture from other places, you might not be feeling the benefits as much as we do in our society. So it's another assumption that we have about life that agriculture is always better than hunter or gathering. Another deep assumption is that humans are always getting more complex or better. And we tried to adjust this a little bit when we were talking about biological evolution because it's an assumption that comes into biological evolution as well, that organisms are always getting better and better and fitter and fitter. And so we talked about extinction of the fittest, and that fitness can only be measured within a particular environment. But we see this in terms of the idea that life itself, human life, is always getting more complex by the day. Another assumption is that whenever you have complexity, whenever society gets complex, you're going to have social inequality or hierarchy. There's nothing we can do about it. Maybe it's our deep psychology, maybe it's evolution, maybe it's just what we need to do to organize ourselves in groups. But the idea is that we have to have this or else. We can't live without it. And in fact, there's actually a very deep assumption, which goes back to Thomas Hobbes about 500 years ago, but has persisted with us to this day. It's the idea that if we don't have the police around, if we don't have a state government telling us what to do and setting laws down, then it's just going to be the law of the jungle. Everybody's going to beat each other up and kill each other. And if there weren't a state society regulating us, things would be really bad. Just be all against all, the war of everyone against everyone, as Thomas Hobbes put it. Again, this persists. It's an idea that is still to this day, it persists. My job in this class is not necessarily to disprove these things, but I do want you to think about them. I do want you to call them into question a little bit because the evidence is mixed, I would say. These are assumptions that were made about human history. These are things that people want to believe. They've become deeply embedded in our thoughts about life. They're so embedded that it's very difficult to dislodge them. Tried to do it with biological evolution, but it's hard to do. It's so deeply embedded. So our goal in this class is at least to just think about this for a little bit. Now, bands, tribes, and chiefdoms. So again, these are organizational categories that anthropologists and archaeologists do use to describe different kinds of societies. So, in general, we talk about hunter-gatherers as living in bands or kin groups. Now, we talked about how those kin groups were not necessarily close kin. In fact, they were very mobile and could trade around, but we still have this idea that they come in these small bands, that they're agriculturalists or people who farm that come in tribes. And then there are more larger categories of people who form themselves into more hierarchical chiefdoms, often corresponding to pastoral societies or societies who herd. We have these hierarchical societies, and so you have chiefs, people at the top who are telling other people what to do, but there's some interesting caveats. We used to think that they just evolved into each other, and it's a puzzle. It seems like they should. Everybody used to think, well, you just get these bands, and then they become tribes, and then they become chiefdoms. But when we look at the evidence, they don't evolve into each other. More like they coexist. Sometimes chiefdoms go and become tribes, and tribes become bands. They don't actually evolve in one direction or another. They also don't necessarily neatly correspond onto a certain social form or organization, and they don't organize or they don't signify that society has necessarily gotten more complex. There are different ways that people organize their societies under different resources. Personally, the last time, I'm not sure if I high key or I low key hate these terms. I'll say low key for now. I high key hated them last year, but this year I just low key hate them. I hate these terms because they come loaded with a bunch of stereotypes in our minds already. And so we have this idea of a tribe, which in archaeology and the anthropologists use in a specific technical way. But our idea of a tribe, well, what does every tribe have in our idea? If you went out and found a tribe, who would you be looking for? Only a chief, or a leader or a chief. So in our notion, in the popular notion, chiefs and tribes are just the same thing, or the chief is the head of the tribe. But archaeologically and anthropologically, these are supposed to be two different things. So I don't like these terms, but they do give us at least a sense of there are lots of different ways that humans organize themselves. And as long as you don't bring in these stereotypes, this is some linear progression from one society to another, you can use these terms. I'm not a big user of them, as you can see, but it tells us different things about human life. So, if cities and states and these societies don't just evolve, how did we get them? Now, there's been a lot of ideas or a lot of debate about why the state came. One of the earlier theories was the idea that cities and states, and especially despotic states, arose because of irrigation and the necessity to control the works of irrigating farmland. You needed somebody in charge to do that. And so the idea is you had to have a state. Again, as we've looked at the evidence, there are places that have irrigation that seem to be able to organize that collectively without having to have a despotic ruler or a state. But there are also areas where there is a state, very powerful state, that doesn't necessarily have irrigation. So it was a great idea, but it doesn't seem to cover all the cases. There's another theory your textbook mentions, which is more complicated, it was called the circumscription theory, where you have concentration of resources and then your population grows, as we talked about last time, and then you have conflict over resources, and so you would organize yourself into a state. Again, this is an interesting idea. It seems to cover certain areas of the world, certain parts of the world. It might explain their development. But there's a key quote here on page 235, which stands for everything I'm trying to tell you at the end of this chapter, or many of the things, is that archaeologists have generally moved away from large universal theories toward more nuanced investigations. Just like we were talking about with the emergence of agriculture, that we used to think, oh, it's all the same thing all over the world. It must have been population pressure, or it must have been climate change. Same thing with cities and states, or there was this idea that they naturally evolve, or they evolve all over the world because of the same reasons. And for the most part, we have had to revise or discard those ideas in favor of looking more carefully at the specific evidence, specific cases. One of the other things that this chapter touches upon and started to do at the beginning was the idea of social stratification, especially in these early cities. So social stratification, we talked about it a little bit in terms of a chiefdom, for example, is when you organize or people are put into groups or put themselves into groups, which you have the people on top, the elites, and people on the bottom, and maybe some middle people too. How do we find evidence for social stratification if we're looking archaeologically for it? Burials are a good indication of what might be going on in terms of social stratification. Is a person buried with a bunch of good stuff? And are other people buried with nothing? And that might indicate that there's social stratification, especially if it's a child or that hasn't done much in their life and dies early and is buried with a bunch of jewels. You might say, well, that person must have been part of an elite group. Another way to look at this is in terms of craft specialization. So archaeologically, we can look for areas in which people start to specialize in certain jobs, like being potters or being the farming gets put in one particular place, or the people who are carpenters or stonemasons. And so we can find evidence for that archaeologically, and we can look at the size of houses in those places and see if there's some correlation between that and stratification. Now, a lot of you wondered, how did we get stratified? And honestly, that is a great question. Most of the time, stratification has been associated with agriculture. We used to think that only in agricultural societies could you have this stratification because that's the only places where they would store wealth. But it turns out on closer investigation that there's inequalities or stratification in some hunting and gathering groups as well. We've also found that especially some of the early agricultural societies and some of the earliest cities were pretty egalitarian. People moved up and down in the wealth structure. It wasn't necessarily that they were locked into place. And so again, it's very frustrating, actually. You wish there was some clear evidence for why this happened and what exactly happened. But the point of the matter is, in different cases, there were different ideas about stratification. They do make one interesting claim here that when we look back archaeologically, that the societies with the biggest wealth disparities, we talked about this. Remember, the societies with the biggest wealth disparities, at least archaeologically, what did they have? Yeah, it's just a note there. And this might need further investigation, but it looks like the societies that had big animals, oh, you remember talking about the horses and the cows and the things that could pull plows, draft animals, also tended to have the largest social stratification or wealth disparities. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that this is a hard and fast rule, but it's an interesting observation. The ability of humans to domesticate large animals and where those were found is a pretty key issue in a lot of human history. And so this is one of the indications of it. The textbook has another section that talks about why human societies tend toward complexity. Why do they tend toward complexity? What happened to those Greeks? It was actually my question too. It's like, well, do they? Because what makes you upset in human life? When you look back, not at the Greeks.
What makes me upset?
Yeah, you got upset. Look at that. That's a bunch of
Stupid.
It looks stupid. Look at that modern house. It looks all boxy and stupid. Yeah. What happened to the Victorian architecture? That's cool. Right. Yeah, no, I had to go back and find some images to see what you were talking about. I don't know. Maybe some people like living in a little box. This image has been circulating a little bit about McDonald's.
Yeah, this is like exactly what I'm talking about.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You wish you grew up when I grew up in the 1980s when things were fun and colorful. It was like a treehouse. You go to McDonald's now, it's like you're in a prison. It's like you're in a dungeon or something. What the heck? What happened to the good stuff? Why can't we build beautiful things anymore? I don't know. Maybe some people like this. You just go in there and stare at your screens, order something from a screen. You never have to talk to anybody. Your food comes to you. Back in the old days, we just had to sit there and talk to that smiling tree. It was scary, but it was fun, colorful. Life has been drained of all color. I don't know. Yeah. My goodness. Or do they? I don't know if they tend towards complexity. Let me put it to you this way. If you live in a complex society, it can actually make your individual life simpler. In the old days, when people had to hunt and gather and do everything, you had to do all these tasks. You had to do everything. And so it was actually your day was complicated. In the new days, you go to a factory and just do this all day long and you hammer things, and then you get replaced by a robot and then you have nothing to do. So in some ways, the more complex the society gets, our individual lives can be simpler. Also, in some ways, the more complicated our tools are, the less skill we need to operate them. Let me give you an example. One of the simplest tools in the world is a lasso. It is a rope you loop up and then you lasso a running animal. Simplest tool in the world, maybe. A rope with a loop in it. It takes a little bit of skill to make one, but I could hand it to you. How many of you, if I handed you a lasso, could then use it to lasso a running animal? For most of the people who live in lasso societies, this takes years and years of practice. It's hard to do. Whereas if I handed you the newest version of the iPhone, how long would it take before you could use it? You could figure it out. That one you can figure out in about 30 seconds because all you have to do is push some buttons like this. So our skills in some ways, we're button pushers now. We don't need these complex skills that come from handling lassos and knives and digging sticks and shovels because our tools are more complex. And so our authors tell us that we don't tend toward the biggest stuff. There is no singular reason why human societies trend toward complexity. There's not one reason, and there's not one particular path down which all societies are going or moving.